Hello, this is a short video presentation on the public debate focusing on fairness when looking at changes to the transport system, in particular looking at Twitter narratives about changes to transport systems in London, walking, cycling, active travel, that kind of thing, a little bit from Oxford and Birmingham as well, over the last 12 months over COVID. My name is Charlie Hicks. I'm a research assistant at LSE Cities, and I'm also a county councillor in Oxford, where we've been doing some of these changes as well. So broadly, what we're going to be looking at through this presentation is the frequency and the narratives that come up relating to fairness, and also those not relating to fairness, on both those who are against these changes and those who are for these changes. So the main takeaway is that those who are against seem to appeal to fairness, inequity and injustice more than those who are in favour of these changes. So those who are against, about 80% of their narratives look at fairness either in procedure or in outcome, and about 20% on whether the outcome is good or bad. And then those who are in favour of these changes spend only about 20% of their time talking about fairness and 80% of the time talking about overall whether this stuff is good or not. And that's an interesting distinction. That's my reading, at least, a sort of a guesstimate from having spent time following it. So what are those narratives? Those who are against, what do people say? They say that, broadly speaking, it's dividing the community, that narrative. It's socially unjust, it's unfair. There's lots of screenshots here. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but if you want to pause the video and have a look, please do. So these changes are divisive, and we are one community fighting against the low traffic neighbourhoods or cycle lanes, what people say who are against. So the process is unfair. About 30% of the narrative, give or take, is on this, about process unfairness of those who are against. So some of the examples: it's a wrong time to implement during a pandemic. Who gets to decide? It's an abuse of power by the councils. This decision is predetermined and we're not being listened to by the councils. There's a lack of baseline evidence on this. And so that's about 30% of the narrative on process being unfair. Now, about 50% of the narrative is about the outcome being unfair. This is discriminatory. Who feels the benefits, who feels the costs? So discriminatory against people who live on the main roads, they get more air pollution. This is discriminatory against people who are disabled, discrimination against elderly people, discrimination against the working class of people who live in the area, who live there for years, discrimination against BAME and minority communities, discrimination by the middle class. This is a middle class gentrification on those who are not middle class. Discrimination against people who drive cars, pushed in the media, less on Twitter. Discrimination against those with caring needs, so those who care for others professionally or sort of not being paid, as well as people with mobility needs. Discrimination against people who run businesses, and discrimination against the taxi trade. And this idea that it's shifting traffic from the rich streets to the poor streets, and therefore there's a sort of socioeconomic injustice there. And then, so on top of that, sort of 80% talking about fairness and unfairness, there's also 20% saying overall these are bad policies. So bad for climate and air pollution because cars have to drive further, emergency services get delayed, streets becoming less safe, isolation is going up, and those kind of more generic, these are bad outcomes for everybody. So in contrast, what are the people who are in favour saying? So overall, the narrative is about this will be better, sort of generally better, more livable, cleaner, safer, quieter streets. There's a very small amount looking at process fairness. So the process is fair because it's democratic, it's democracy in action, it's politicians who are democratically elected choosing this. And all the polling says that people want this to happen. So actually, democracy says that this should go ahead, and that's good process. A little bit more, but still not that much, about how the status quo things as they are is unfair. So highways engineers prioritise cars over cyclists. Cycling is more dangerous than other forms of transport. That's not fair by comparison. And parked cars are inconsiderate. They park in people who drive and park their cars are inconsiderate in cycle lanes or pavements. And there's some inequity or sort of socially unjust element to that as well. And the idea that people who live in the area don't actually own the cars. So there's an inequality between people who live in the area, what that's used for, versus people that live outside. But much more of the narrative is about, well, it's just bad overall. There's not making comparisons, but just saying it's a general bad. So the status quo, so as it is bad, and then what's in the future is what we're aiming for is good. So status quo is bad. Safety, looking at pedestrians and vulnerable road users, cars taking up too much space, and this is bad. streets are not for children, and that narrative took off in the Netherlands when their transport system was changing. Our streets don't have clean air. People shouldn't be taking shortcuts. That's just not what these streets were made for, and that's just being used incorrectly. Too many people are dying or seriously injured on the roads, and that's a societal bad. Cars are contributing to the climate crisis. That's a societal bad. Cars are contributing to poor health and inactivity. So these things are generally bad rather than being unfair. They're just social ills. Cars are inefficient space, so we should be looking for a better transport system that uses better space. Conversely, outcome is good. So what we currently have status quo is bad, and what we're aiming for is good. Quieter, more peaceful streets, friendly for children, fewer road collisions, injuries and fatalities. The air is cleaner. We can reuse this space for community and for nature. Cycling and walking rates are going up, better for business. And then there's also, to provide evidence of these claims, there's quite a lot of evidence that's used to say that either to refute claims of those against, or to put forward evidence to back up the claims. So more people are walking and cycling. There's a whole sort of bank of evidence that's pushed out on Twitter as well, like this. Interestingly, there's very few narratives that refute the discriminatory or unfair thing, the narratives from those against. That seems to be broadly left alone by those who are in favour, apart from a few brave politicians or academics who say, well, actually, the evidence doesn't stack up that way. That's sort of interesting. Other contextual factors that's just worth mentioning. So those who are in favour believe that transport behaviour change will happen. Those who are against believe that people will stay driving in their cars and will just go further. Interesting to look at who is against. So people who drive for work, people with limited mobility, people who perceive that the traffic is going up on their streets, and some people who run businesses. Broadly speaking, 99 times out of 100, those are the people who are speaking out against. And those who are speaking out in favour tend to have low car dependency themselves, have small children, motivated by the climate crisis, or broadly speaking, are not in those previous four categories, tend to be in favour. So over the last sort of 12 months following this and researching for this video, what are some of the main takeaways that I have taken from it? So broadly speaking, those who are against the narrative speak to injustice, inequality, unfairness, and have a sort of outrage, emotional overtone, broadly speaking. Those who are in favour look broadly at the overall goods and the overall bads, but don't talk so much about inequality or unfairness in those narratives, and often use research and the sort of rational mind to back those up. Just looking a bit more in the emotion, because I think it's really important to understand the emotional overtones of these narratives. On the left, those who are against tends to be outrage, anger. Some appeal to care, some appeal to unity, but seeking to sort of right the wrongs of the injustice. And those who are in favour, there is some of that saying, well, we need to right the wrongs of the existing injustice or the climate crisis, but more often it's about, there's a sort of led by the sort of rational academic, this is right or this is overall better, and we can prove it with this evidence. So less emotional in that sense. Although that's very high level and it's much more nuanced than that, but that's the high level sort of emotional debate that's going on as I see it. To reiterate, this I think is really important. Who is speaking out against? People that drive for work, people with limited mobility, people who see traffic go up in front of their houses, and some business owners. And then one of the main things that I think is really important in this debate, talking about fairness and injustice, is actually what seems like on the surface quite innocuous changes, putting a cycle lane or a low traffic neighborhood, asking people to drive a little bit further, gets this massive reaction. And why? And I think it's because it's shining a light on real structural inequalities for education and job type, for income and wealth, for workers' rights, and for health. And some of these really broad, and how decisions are made and how power is distributed in society. Who gets to make those decisions, and those things are getting, it's those nerves that are being touched, and that's what's then causing the big backlash. And so really it's an interesting, shining a spotlight on those changes, and that has to be considered as well as part of what is fair, what is equitable, when thinking about making changes in transport. I hope those were some interesting ideas, and I look forward to discussing more in the workshop. Thanks very much.